The courtroom was quiet. You could almost hear the tension dripping from the walls like invisible rain. The woman at the defendant's table sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were calm, yet focused, like someone who had already lived through the worst days of her life. Her name was Danielle Brooks, a 32-year-old single mother, a hardworking employee at a community legal center, and now, suddenly, the target of a high-profile defamation lawsuit filed by one of the most powerful lawyers in the city. Sitting just across from her was Richard Langston, a sharp-dressed white attorney with slicked-back hair and a smirk permanently etched on his face. He was known for his arrogance, his connections, and his ruthless courtroom tactics. To him, this case wasn't about justice. It was about putting Danielle back in her place after she dared to call him out publicly for discriminatory behavior. He had already won in his mind. He didn't see Danielle as a worthy opponent. She was, to him, just another angry black woman with a chip on her shoulder. And unfortunately for Richard, that was his biggest mistake. Danielle wasn't angry. She was determined. "Let's begin," the judge said, his voice echoing across the chamber like a gavel itself. Richard stood up with theatrical confidence, flipping open his sleek leather folder. "Your Honor," he began, glancing smugly at the jury, "what we have here is a clear case of slander. My client, that is, myself, has been publicly humiliated by this woman's unfounded accusations. She claims I made racially charged comments during a legal meeting. She then posted about it online, painting me as a bigot, and that post received over 2 million views. I lost a major client because of that. I want justice." He turned to Danielle, shaking his head as if scolding a child. "You see, Ms. Brooks seems to believe that she can attack a respected member of this profession and hide behind the veil of emotion. But we are here for facts, not feelings." Danielle didn't flinch. She looked straight ahead, not meeting his eyes. Her calmness rattled him more than anger would have. When it was her turn, Danielle stood slowly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was strong, steady like a river that had carved its way through stone. "Your Honor, I never wanted this," she began. "I wasn't trying to ruin anyone. I just spoke the truth." During a legal aid conference, Mr. Langston made a comment. He said, and I quote, "Some people only get ahead because of diversity hires, not because of merit." He looked directly at me when he said it. There was a low murmur among the jury. I was humiliated in front of my peers. I walked out of that meeting with tears in my eyes, not because I'm weak, but because I've heard that kind of thing my whole life. But this time I decided to speak out. I shared what happened, and the world listened. Richard jumped up. "Objection. That's not a direct quote. There is no recording." The judge raised a hand. "Let her finish." Danielle continued, her voice now trembling, but not with fear. "I didn't make that post for revenge. I made it for every young black girl sitting in a classroom right now being told she's too loud, too angry, too ambitious. I made it so maybe the next time someone like Mr. Langston decides to say something like that, he'll think twice." The courtroom was still. Even the air seemed to pause. Then came the witnesses. One by one, people from the conference stepped forward. A Latina paralegal who'd been in the room. A junior lawyer who had overheard the hallway conversation. Each of them, initially afraid to speak up, now stood with Danielle. They had all heard it. They had all seen it. The judge leaned forward, his brows knitted. "Mr. Langston, do you deny making the comment?" Richard laughed nervously. "It was taken out of context. Is that a yes or no?" The judge pressed. "I may have made a general observation about diversity initiatives," Richard replied. "But it wasn't targeted. Yet you looked directly at Ms. Brooks?" Richard was now sweating. Danielle sat quietly, her hands still clasped, her eyes filled with something new. Hope. The judge then reached for a manila folder. "We received a confidential tip this morning. It appears your firm, Mr. Langston, has had multiple complaints filed against you regarding inappropriate workplace comments. Most were buried." Richard's face went pale. Ms. Brooks may have started the conversation, but she wasn't the first to feel it. She was just the first to be heard. Continuing from the emotional courtroom scene, where things begin to shift. As the courtroom settled back into a tense hush, Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes locking on Mr. Whitmore. the white attorney whose arrogance had so far filled the room like a thick fog. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge began, his tone stern but composed, "I want you to repeat the exact statement you made earlier about Ms. Jenkins' qualifications." Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, I merely stated that, given the nature of the case and the complexity of the law, perhaps someone with more seasoned experience would have handled the defense better." "A more seasoned experience?" the judge echoed with a raised eyebrow. "Or are you implying something else entirely?" For the first time, Whitmore looked flustered. He straightened his tie, glancing sideways at his assistant, then back at the judge. "I assure you, there was no racial undertone to my observation." The room remained still. The jury sat stiffly, watching this slow unraveling. Ms. Jenkins stood silently at her table, calm and composed, refusing to let his words sink into her spirit. She had heard worse in her lifetime, and she'd risen above every time. Judge Reynolds wasn't buying the lawyer's attempt to smooth things over. "You're standing in a courtroom built on the foundations of justice and equality," the judge said, his voice rising just slightly. "And yet you question a woman's intelligence, not based on her arguments or evidence, but cloaked under vague doubts about her seasoning." The words echoed through the courtroom like a hammer striking a bell. At that moment, something shifted. One of the jurors, a middle-aged Latina woman, narrowed her eyes. She scribbled something quickly on her notepad. Another juror, a young black man wearing glasses, leaned forward, now clearly more engaged than before. The energy was turning. Whitmore, trying to gain control again, shuffled his papers. "If I may proceed, Your Honor," he said through clenched teeth, "I'd like to call my next witness." But the judge raised a hand. "Before we proceed, I'm going to allow Ms. Jenkins the opportunity to respond to your remark." Everyone turned toward her. Ms. Jenkins took a deep breath. Her hands were steady as she stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began. "This isn't the first time someone in a suit has questioned my place in a courtroom. I've faced raised eyebrows, hushed whispers, and outright disbelief at the notion that a black woman could not only understand the law, but wield it powerfully." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "But I didn't choose this profession to be comfortable. I chose it because my community needed me. I chose it because little girls like my niece deserve to see someone who looks like them standing here with confidence, strength, and truth." A murmur moved through the crowd. The gallery, filled with citizens, attorneys, and students, now leaned in, not out of curiosity, but admiration. "And as for experience," she continued, "I've defended clients in over 300 cases, successfully argued in appellate courts, and earned a degree from one of the top law schools in the country. My experience doesn't wear gray hair or carry a cane, but it speaks volumes in every motion I file, in every cross-examination I conduct, and every time I walk into a courtroom prepared." Silence. Even Whitmore had nothing to say. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. You may continue." With renewed energy, Ms. Jenkins called her final witness, a quiet, elderly man who had been a janitor in the building where the incident in question had occurred. His words were soft, but what he said was loud in meaning. "I seen the whole thing," he told the court. "That man right there," he said, pointing to the plaintiff whom Mr. Whitmore represented. "He pushed her. It wasn't no accident. He was shouting all kind of ugly things. Called her names I ain't said since I was a boy growing up in the segregated South." Whitmore jumped from his seat. "Objection. Hearsay." But the judge waved him off. The witness saw it himself. "Continue." The testimony was damning. Everything that Whitmore had built, the illusion of his client being the victim, the charm offensive, the carefully coached witnesses, it all began to crumble. Ms. Jenkins rested her case. The jury left to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway. People whispered and nodded at her, some offering a quiet, "Well done." Whitmore paced in the corner, frustrated and red-faced, mumbling under his breath. After a tense hour, the jury returned. As they filed in, not one juror looked in Whitmore's direction. The forewoman, a tall woman in her 50s with a calm expression, stood with the verdict in her hand. In the case of Jordan Fields versus the state of New York, we, the jury, find in favor of the defendant. Gasps fill the room. Ms. Jenkins closed her eyes for just a second, letting the weight of it wash over her. The judge smiled faintly. The verdict is accepted. Case dismissed. But before Whitmore could gather his things and storm out, Judge Reynolds spoke again. "Mr. Whitmore," he said firmly, "approach the bench." Whitmore hesitated. He walked forward, shoulders tense. "I want it on the record that this court does not tolerate veiled discrimination," the judge stated, his voice clear and final. "You disrespected this courtroom, and more importantly, you disrespected a capable, honorable attorney based on deeply inappropriate biases." Whitmore opened his mouth to argue, but the judge continued. "As such, I am recommending you for a professional review at the State Bar." The color drained from Whitmore's face. The courtroom was still, silent. People didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched as justice, slow but steady, finally turned its head and looked the right way. Now the verdict has been declared, but what happens afterward changes lives even more deeply. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a soft gray, the kind that blankets the city with an almost poetic stillness. People emerged from the courthouse building in small clusters, some talking in hushed tones, others still processing what had just occurred. News vans were already pulling up near the curb, reporters hustling to get statements from anyone willing to speak. Ms. Jenkins stepped outside, her briefcase in hand, shoulders back, chin high. A young law student approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "Ms. Jenkins," she said nervously, "I'm interning for the public defender's office this summer. I just wanted to say, you're incredible. That was powerful." Ms. Jenkins smiled warmly. "Thank you. Stick with it. We need you." The student nodded enthusiastically, and, as she turned to go, a man stepped up beside Ms. Jenkins. It was the elderly janitor who had testified. "You did right in there," he said, his voice weathered with years but full of pride. "People like him," he added, referring to Whitmore. "They've been running this show too long. About time someone reminded them that justice doesn't wear just one color." Ms. Jenkins nodded. "I didn't do it alone. Your truth helped carry this case." He tipped his hat and walked away slowly, leaving her in a moment of quiet. Then came the cameras. Reporters swarmed her, questions flying from every direction. "Ms. Jenkins, how does it feel to win against a prominent name like Whitmore? Do you feel justice was served today? Will you be filing a formal complaint against Mr. Whitmore for his remarks in court?" She raised a hand, asking for calm. "My job," she said, "is not about defeating someone. It's about defending the truth. Today wasn't about me or Mr. Whitmore. It was about a client who deserved to be heard, and a system that needed to listen." And with that, she walked away. No further comments, no victory speech. Just silence, grace, and strength. But elsewhere in the city, things were stirring. News clips from the courtroom were already going viral. Footage of Ms. Jenkins' defense, especially her powerful courtroom statement, had hit social media. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeWithJenkins and #LawyerLikeMe began trending. Comment sections flooded with responses. "She handled herself with so much class. I hope my daughter sees this. This woman is what legal power looks like. I hope Whitmore never shows his face in court again." But not all comments were kind. Some defended Whitmore, claiming he was being unfairly accused of racism. Others tried to minimize Ms. Jenkins' win by attributing it to wokeness rather than legal skill. She saw it all, but she chose what to focus on. In her small apartment later that evening, Ms. Jenkins finally sat down. The day's adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its place. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues, friends, and even people she hadn't spoken to in years. One message stood out. It was from her niece. "Annie, I told everyone at school you were a superhero. They didn't believe me. But today I showed them the video. Now they all want to be like you." Ms. Jenkins smiled. This was why she did what she did. The courtroom victory wasn't just about clearing a client's name. It was about carving out a place in history where women who looked like her were seen as leaders, warriors, truth-tellers. Meanwhile, Whitmore's world was unraveling. Inside his office, his once confident demeanor had shattered. His assistant handed him a letter from the State Bar. The formal inquiry had already begun. And worse, several clients had called to cancel their retainers. Sponsors and firms that had once championed him now distanced themselves in silence. He stared out his high-rise office window, the city lights cold and indifferent. He had underestimated her, not just as a lawyer, but as a human being. And now, the price of his arrogance was finally coming due. Across town, a local community center organized an impromptu gathering to celebrate Ms. Jenkins. Elders brought food, children waved signs that read, "Our Hero," and local musicians played softly in the background. When Ms. Jenkins arrived, it was as if the entire neighborhood had shown up. There were speeches, poems, hugs, and even tears. One older woman took the mic, voice shaky with emotion. "We prayed for this day," she said, "for a day when one of our own wouldn't just survive the system, but reshape it." The applause was thunderous, but Ms. Jenkins remained grounded. She thanked them humbly, reminding everyone that this wasn't her last fight. "There are more battles ahead," she said, "but I won't stop until every voice, every color, every truth is heard." And they believed her, because in her, they saw more than just a lawyer. They saw a movement. Now, let's look at how this one courtroom moment sparked something far greater. In the weeks that followed the trial, the ripple effect of Ms. Jenkins' courtroom triumph extended far beyond that single legal victory. What had started as a tense, racially charged court case turned into a national conversation, one about race, power, justice, and the evolving face of the American legal system. Universities invited Ms. Jenkins to speak at their law schools. Her inbox overflowed with invitations from panels, interviews, and podcasts. Even daytime talk shows called, eager to have her share her story. But what moved her most weren't the bright lights or the applause. It was the quiet, personal messages, the handwritten letters, the voice note from aspiring young Black lawyers and first-generation students saying, "You showed me I can do this too." One message read, "I've never seen someone who looked like me stand that strong in court. Thank you for showing us how power doesn't always roar. It can walk in heels, carry a briefcase, and speak with purpose." Meanwhile, reform groups seized the momentum. Legal advocacy organizations highlighted her case as an example of what needs to change. Courtroom decorum, racial microaggressions, and the unchecked power of seasoned attorneys who believe they're untouchable. Ms. Jenkins was invited to sit on a panel that reviewed professional conduct policies for attorneys, ensuring that racial and gender-based disrespect would no longer be dismissed as mere banter. And across the country, junior attorneys, especially women of color, started holding their heads a little higher in courtrooms. They began referencing Ms. Jenkins' case when they needed courage to object, to stand, to speak. She had unintentionally become a symbol, not of perfection, but of resistance with dignity. One of the most powerful scenes unfolded weeks later, not in a courtroom, but in a small law school auditorium in Alabama. Ms. Jenkins was speaking on power in the presence of prejudice. The room was filled with students, some still in jeans and backpacks, others already suited up as clerks and interns. She told her story, not just of that trial, but of the many times she'd been underestimated, belittled, overlooked. "I wasn't raised to win popularity contests," she said, voice calm but firm. "I was raised to know who I am, even when the room tries to forget." When she finished, the room rose to its feet in thunderous applause. But just as she was about to step down, a quiet voice called out from the back. It was a young man, white, soft-spoken, maybe early 20s. He stood up nervously. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, "I want to thank you. I used to think racism in the legal world was exaggerated. But after seeing how Mr. Whitmore treated you and how you still handled it with such class, I realized how blind I've been." The room went still. Ms. Jenkins walked toward him, extended a hand, and said, "Thank you for seeing it." That's where change begins. Back in the legal world, Mr. Whitmore's suspension from practice had grown from weeks to a full review. The board cited not just misconduct during the trial, but a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Several clients who had once stood by him now claimed they'd felt his dismissiveness too, especially those from marginalized communities. For the first time in his career, Whitmore was no longer the giant in the courtroom. He was now the subject of scrutiny, a man forced to confront the very bias he once refused to acknowledge. But Ms. Jenkins wasn't celebrating his fall. She was busy building something new. She co-founded an initiative called the Equal Bench Project, designed to mentor and support young attorneys from underrepresented backgrounds. Through workshops, scholarships, and one-on-one mentorship, she made sure others would have the tools she never did starting out. Success shouldn't be a lottery ticket, she often said. It should be a ladder, and everyone deserves a step. She also worked with judges and law clerks on training around implicit bias and courtroom equity. Judges who had once let lawyers like Whitmore speak without filter now paused, watched more carefully, and even intervened when language crossed the line. Even her client, the one at the heart of the case, sent her a letter months later. "Ms. Jenkins, I don't even have the words. I was scared when this all began, but you fought for me like I mattered. And because of you, I believe I do. Thank you." In that quiet moment, reading those words alone in her office, Ms. Jenkins let a tear fall. Not because of fame, not because of recognition, but because truth had spoken louder than prejudice. And justice, true, clear-eyed, compassionate justice, had been served. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning, because when one voice speaks up, it echoes in hearts far beyond the courtroom walls. And when that voice carries courage, it can move mountains. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was a spark that started a fire of change. And that fire was only getting started. Years passed, but the courtroom moment that once stunned the nation remained etched in history. Not just because a white lawyer was publicly corrected, but because a new era of accountability had begun. Ms. Jenkins became a name associated with dignity and change, but she remained grounded. Despite national recognition, magazine features, and even discussions about turning her story into a documentary, she never lost her reason for stepping into the courtroom in the first place. Justice for those who felt unseen. And while the headlines faded from public attention, the quiet impact continued. One young girl in Detroit, age 12, watched the courtroom clip of Ms. Jenkins standing tall and eloquent. Inspired, she wrote in her diary, "One day I'll be a lawyer like her. I'll protect people with my words." Years later, she would apply to law school under a scholarship created by Jenkins Foundation. In California, a judge who once believed silence was impartiality began addressing subtle microaggressions from lawyers directly in court. He cited the Jenkins-Whitmore case as a personal turning point. In Washington, D.C., a law professor included the case in a class on modern legal ethics, using it to teach how unchecked bias can erode fairness. Her students discussed it passionately, debating not only the legality, but the moral implications of what unfolded in that courtroom. The conversation reached even deeper within the legal profession. Senior attorneys began mentoring young minority lawyers with more empathy. Diversity workshops weren't seen as optional anymore. They were essential. And firms that had long promoted colorblind policies began actively addressing systemic gaps in their hiring, retention, and case distribution. What was once considered a one-time core drama had quietly planted seeds of reform. But perhaps the most profound shift happened within Ms. Jenkins herself. She had seen the face of prejudice and spoken truth to power. And though it hadn't been easy, it had given her a new kind of power, one rooted in authenticity. She no longer felt she had to soften her tone or mask her brilliance to be accepted in the room. She walked into courtrooms not just as a litigator, but as a symbol of the future. The irony? Mr. Whitmore's downfall had sparked his own journey too. After his license was temporarily revoked, he withdrew from the spotlight. For months, no one heard from him. Then, almost a year later, an op-ed appeared in a legal journal titled "The Silence That Speaks." It was signed by Richard Whitmore. In it he wrote, "For years, I measure my success by how many times the jury ruled in my favor, never once questioning how I treated those around me. I saw myself as superior because the system rewarded my aggression. But I now realize I wasn't being fearless. I was being blind. Ms. Jenkins didn't just defeat me in court, she reminded me of what I had forgotten. That respect is not optional, and no amount of experience makes you immune to accountability. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, one few expected, but it didn't erase his past. It only began to make sense of it. Whitmore never returned to the courtroom in the same way. Instead, he began working behind the scenes, offering legal workshops to students in underserved schools. He would never be the hero in this story, but he had begun his own quiet reckoning. Ms. Jenkins, on the other hand, continued her work with the Equal Bench Project, expanding it to multiple states. She started training programs specifically for courtroom confidence, teaching young attorneys, especially women and people of color, how to navigate and challenge systemic power dynamics. Her core message? The courtroom is not neutral ground unless we make it so. And silence is never an option when someone tries to silence you. She also returned to her roots, mentoring in the same community where she grew up, reminding students from low-income neighborhoods that they belonged in the rooms they were taught to fear. In one memorable event, she visited her old high school. The auditorium was packed. She stood at the podium in the same hall where she once sat in the back row, dreaming of a future far away from the judgment and noise. People will tell you who you're supposed to be, she said. They'll try to define your voice, your worth, your potential. But don't wait for permission to prove them wrong. Just walk in, speak up, and own every inch of space you've earned. That line went viral. It became a motto printed on classroom walls, screensavers, and even stitched into blazers by law school grads. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming space. And in the end, that's what her legacy became. A roadmap for courage, justice, and growth. Because the courtroom isn't just a place where verdicts are given. It's a place where history is made, where voices rise, where truth echoes, where even those mocked can rise higher than anyone expected. Ms. Jenkins didn't just win a case that day. She won hearts. She won change. And long after the gavel had fallen, her story continued to teach the world one simple, powerful truth. Dignity will always outlast disrespect. And justice? Justice, when fueled by courage, will always speak loudest.